But that's another resonance. It was Saddam who, when he was caught and first emerged in court, said almost word for word, by what power do you put me on trial? The Charles I gambit. But it took a long time, didn't it, as lawyers in the room will know, before international law developed any kind of rule that permitted or that answered the question, by what power do you put me on trial, me being a political military leader? Nowhere in the 19th century do we get it, no, and not in the 20th. After the First World War, though at Versailles, Lloyd George came to Versailles armed with lots of legal opinions, and the "Hang the Kaiser" was his motto, and the Kaiser was, they even had Article 225 of the Versailles Treaty. They were going to set up an international court of 5 judges with, and prosecute the Kaiser for the aggression by invading Belgium and for unrestricted submarine warfare. But, of course, hang the Kaiser remained unhung. Woodrow Wilson decided that he had sovereign immunity, and so they couldn't prosecute him. They went and he went to Holland and lived happily ever after. So one wonders whether Hitler would have been quite so keen for aggression in Czechoslovakia and Poland had there been a precedent for putting heads of state on trial. But there was not sovereign immunity covered. And even the genocide, as we would now call it, if we weren't Turkish, of the Armenians in 1915 was overlooked. A few trials of the Young Turks in 1919 were allowed to peter out, and there was no law developed at all. It wasn't till the Second World War. It was, in fact, just before the Second World War that a group of English socialists hit upon the idea of a universal human rights treaty where there would be actually enforceable laws and rules, and that leaders could be put on trial. This was a little group chaired by H.G. Wells. J.B. Priestley was on it. A.A. Milne would motor up from Pooh Corner to add his bit to the draft. And they produced a wonderful little Penguin special, H.G. Wells on the Rights of Man, with this idea in it. And it wasn't, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies. This was 1939, when the war clouds were beginning, and it seemed to be some sort of hope against the Holocaust. And it was translated into 30 languages. The Foreign Office translated it into German and dropped it on the Nazi tanks as they came across France. They didn't stop to read it. But someone who did was Franklin Roosevelt, who was the friend of H.G. Wells, and it formed his For Freedom speech after Pearl Harbor. What are we fighting for? Freedom of speech and religion, freedom from want and fear. And then in January 1942, we get the Atlantic Charter, in which the Allies signed up to secure human rights. The first time in modern period we get the idea of human rights in our own lands and that of others. And then came the big question, back to the Charles I question: what do you do with the Nazi leaders? Now, Winston Churchill was a great admirer of Oliver Cromwell. Oddly enough, he tried to name a ship after Oliver Cromwell when he was head of the Admiralty, and the King had been mightily offended and sent a note saying, "How dare you suggest this His Majesty's ship, Oliver Cromwell, this offensive oxymoron." But Churchill had felt that Cromwell had made a mistake in having Charles I executed, And so he opposed any trial, Nuremberg trial of the Nazi leaders. He said, look, well, he drew up a list of the top 75 Nazis, and he said, as soon as they're arrested, we give them 6 hours to say their prayers and then shoot them. That was Churchill. He really feared, of course, that Hitler would use the dock as a soapbox and do the Charles I strut his stuff. Of course, Truman, by now, had become the American president, and he said, memorably, this summary justice would not sit on the American conscience happily or be remembered by our children with pride. We've got to give them the fairest trial that the horrors of the time will allow. And so there was a complete deadlock between the British and Americans over whether Nuremberg should get underway. And it was broken, of course, by the third ally, Joe Stalin, who loved show trials as long as everyone got shot in the end. And he cast his vote for Nuremberg. And so from that unusual beginning. And it was very interesting to see, so the Nuremberg is the first fully fledged trial of heads of state. Hitler, fortunately, had committed suicide, so Churchill wasn't, the British weren't all that worried, but Goering was, in effect, the leader. And so he, at first, decided to adopt the Charles I gambit, the strategy of pleading only to the jurisdiction and not dealing with the merits. And in fact, he called everyone together, all the 23 Nazi defendants at Stammheim prison, and he said, look, we're going to only say 3 words to the court, which was the catch cry of one of Goethe's warrior heroes, loosely translated as lick my ass. That was what they were going to say to the judges. And it was fascinating. We read the story of Nuremberg, how they gradually got suckered into playing the justice game, because they were going to realize that unlike in Nazi courts, they were going to get the opportunity to go into the witness box and make their excuses to posterity and justify themselves if they could. And so they decided in the end to play the justice game and to cooperate. And of course, Nuremberg took place and was quite remarkably successful in the sense that its judgment at Nuremberg has confounded Holocaust deniers throughout. It was, by modern standards, a bit unfair. There was the death penalty, wasn't there, and there was no appeal court. But it was the great, held forth the great promise of international criminal justice, that henceforth those who did mass murder their own people, those who were tyrannous, would be held to account.